and Jonathan and everyone else who made the effort of coming this evening and that you found the place, which was a good beginning for me. Trials and tribulations and got me into the right mood of exploration. What I would like to do in the 20 minutes that I have is really to try and associate the new book I've written with the situation in Gaza, or more precisely with the Western perceptions of what goes on in Gaza, reactions to what goes on in Gaza, and maybe be brave enough to suggest possible scenarios for the future as much as I could in 20 minutes, and I know the chair will promise to give me a 5 minutes warning because this topic can require probably a much longer than 20 minutes, but I will try to be concise. I wrote the book before the events of October the 7th, but I think it's very relevant to the world we are in relations to the Israeli genocide of the people of Gaza, which still continues today, the complicity of the United States and Britain in this genocide, the international silence of the political elites about this genocide, and the fact that, unfortunately, there's nothing new in this Western reaction to the atrocities committed by Israel and before that by the Zionist movement against the Palestinians. In the book, I decided to try and understand the longevity and solidity of the lobby for Israel and Zionism, both in Britain and the United States. It's one of the oldest lobbies in the world. It's already, in the United States, it's more than 100 years old. And in Britain, it already exists for 150 years. There isn't any other lobby for a similar cause that exists not only for so many years, but so many years after supposedly what the lobby was working for has materialized. And in fact, that conundrum was one of the main motives for writing the book. How come the State of Israel invests so much in advocacy and lobbying to convince the world that it's a legitimate state? Not that its policies are legitimate, or not that certain aspects of its history are valid, but that the very existence of Israel, the very idea of the Zionist project, is still valid. And the fact that they have to invest so much money, so much power, so much intimidation, tells you that they know themselves that it's not working. The persuasion is not working. What works, undoubtedly, is intimidation, timidity, bribery. All this works, there's no doubt about it. They are able to either intimidate political and financial elites to support the state, or they are able to seduce them with financial or strategic dividends. But it's very clear that when it comes to what really the advocacy is trying to do, which is to gain moral validity for the project, they are failing year after year since they started in this country in the middle of the 19th century, and in the United States after the end of the First World War. And nonetheless, this is a conundrum not just because they're still trying to do it, which shows that they have real problems with it. It is also quite incredible, the other side of the coin, how the Palestinians are still there, surviving with such an international coalition that supports the idea that they should not be in their own home country and that their homeland should become a European Jewish state instead of their homeland. And yet, they are there, they're fighting, they are resilient, and the balance of power hasn't changed. There's still a very small community of people facing a huge international and powerful coalition. And it started already at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when there was a kind of a triangle of three pillars that supported the idea that Palestine should become a Zionist European state without anyone in Palestine being aware that their fate is being discussed by so many powerful people outside of Palestine. In the great event we had organized by Memo two weeks ago, Professor Radhakarmi, who joined us on the panel, said she was thinking about her grandfather in his village near Jenin, sitting at the time when powerful people around the world were already discussing the possibility that Palestine would be emptied from its native indigenous people and would be replaced by Jewish settlers from Europe. And she said, how could he have been aware of this? There was no way for him to know that he, his children, and his grandchildren are going to be victims of such a project. And that, as I said, began very early. And the triangle that I'm talking about, that did not take into account the Palestinians themselves, was one pillar, or one leg of the triangle, was a certain stream in evangelical Christianity that saw the building of a Jewish state in Palestine as a religious imperative that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the coming of the end of time, and therefore the Jews had to return. This would be an indication that the millennium is coming to an end and a different kind of theological period begins in the history of evangelical Christianity. And these were not just scholars or theologians. There were a lot of laymen connected to this kind of theology that held very powerful positions, both in the United States and in Britain. Positions such as prime ministers, presidents of Supreme Courts in America, who really took this not just as a political, strategic, imperialist project, but also as a religious one. So that was one thing. The second one was, and this I think a lot of people would find very new, I think, the leadership of the Jewish communities in the United States, in Britain, were fearful that anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe would push hundreds of thousands of Jews into Britain and the United States. This was the last thing they wanted. They already made it in Britain for many centuries. They already made it in the United States for at least 50 or 70 years. And the last thing they wanted was waves of poor Jews coming from Eastern Europe to either Britain or the United States. So they supported Zionism mainly to prevent their arrival in their homeland. And that was the second pillar. And again, I'm talking about the elite of the Anglo-American Jewish communities were very powerful as well. The third group were either people in Britain before the Second World War, or Americans after the Second World War, who had imperial interests and designs that included Palestine. When I say included Palestine, it means either in the age of colonialism, before the Second World War, was properly integrating physically Palestine into the British Empire. But after the Second World War, American imperialism, as you know, took a different kind. It was not integrating physically areas into the American empire, but indirectly. So Israel became a very important center for American imperialism in the Arab world and further afield in West Asia. So if you take imperialism, the new and the old one, you take Jewish elites in the West who do not want their brothers and sisters to be with them in their own home countries. and very powerful evangelical Christians, and you look at all these three powerful lobbies and you fuse them into one powerful lobby together, you can understand how what probably some people would have found impossible, in no time, a Jewish state was created through the ruination of Palestine and partial elimination of the Palestinian people. Now, the Palestinians were still there after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, and the Zionist movement continued to try and fulfill through the State of Israel the main impulse of the Zionist project, which was a classical settler colonial project, which was to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And through the book, I show how the lobby had to adapt itself to the new methods Israel was using after 1948 to achieve its basic goal of having the land without the people. After 1967, when Israel occupied the whole of Palestine, the whole of historical Palestine, which it didn't do in 1948, but in 1967, it occupied the whole of historical Palestine, that is Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. It was impossible to repeat what Israel had done in 1948, namely massively and ethnically cleanse half of the Palestinians, which is what they did in 48. So in 1967, when they didn't have the option of repeating the Nakba of 1948, they chose a different method of trying to have the land without the people. And this was by enclaving the people, not expelling them, but imprisoning them in mega prison in part of the West Bank and one big mega prison in the Gaza Strip. And they hoped that this kind of control and oppression would be accepted by the West, which it did, through the very powerful lobbies that they were using with the political elites in Britain and the United States, and that it would be powerful enough to dissuade the Palestinians from trying to rebel against living in these two mega prisons in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the Palestinians did resist. First in the first Intifada in 1987, then came the second Intifada in 2000, and as you know, in the sense among Palestinians was that the most secular and left and center Palestinian liberation movement was not delivering the goods, and some of its leaders were even going alongside with this idea of the open prison. Palestinians moved to give their support and chance to the more political Islamic groups, the Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other movements. And they already were the ones who were leading the second uprising. Israel reacted brutally against the second uprising in the West Bank and had a sense that it could continue with good lobbying and advocacy to brutally oppress the Palestinians in the West Bank, to dissuade them from going to a third uprising. And to a certain extent, again, because the lobby was so solid, so veteran, so old, they succeeded, not with the civil societies, but with the political elites of the West, who gave them immunity for policies that violated every international law we know with regard to the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And at the same time, as we know, the increased Judaization of the West Bank, increasing the number of settlers in the West Bank today up to 700,000. The Gaza Strip was a problem. They even didn't succeed in persuading enough Jewish settlers to go to the Gaza Strip. All in all, at the peak of the Jewish colonization of Gaza, there were a few thousand Jews in the Gaza Strip, where there were already 600,000 Jews in the West Bank. There's something about Gaza that is resilient and resistant like no other part of Palestine. God knows why. But this is true. This is a fact. And they forced the Israelis to take out the settlers. They could not protect them. Of course, the Israelis hoped that there was, especially when I say the Israelis, in particular, the architect of the withdrawal from Gaza, Ariel Sharon, hoped that taking out, if you want, the wardens, the jailers from the prison, he could deal with the prison from the outside without worrying what would happen to the settlers. And indeed, as we know, the moment the settlers were going out and the people of Gaza democratically elected Hamas government, the Israelis, with the help of Britain, the United States, and other sections, punished the Gaza Strip by imposing an inhuman siege on the Strip. And Hamas reacted with launching its Qassam missiles first and so on. And the Israelis for 17 years, until the 7th of October 2023, 4 times, and I want to tell you, I know you know that history, bombarded Gaza from the land, the sea, and the air, especially from the air, using horrific weapons of destruction against the people of Gaza. Now, with every wave of Israeli attack on Gaza, because the people of Gaza were unwilling to live under the system of mega jails that Israel thought was a good alternative to ethnic cleansing. With every such wave, the brutality and dehumanization of the Israeli acts increased exponentially. And we thought, okay, despite the advocacy, despite the lobby, despite of effectiveness and longevity, probably now the elites of the West would say enough is enough. And it didn't happen. 2014 was, before 2023, 2014 was in any respect one of the worst crimes against humanity committed by anyone in the first decades of the 21st century. And it didn't move at all the governments of the United States, of the EU, of Britain, to change their basic policy towards Israel. And when this did not work, the Israelis decided to, were going from one mentality to the other, because you can summarize it by saying the Israelis were using power to impose their will on the Palestinians for the last 120 years with the help of the international community, and failed, so they thought if it didn't work with power, we need to use more power. And that's what happened when the Israeli electorate chose a government that actually its philosophy is that the other governments failed in defeating the Palestinians because it was not brutal enough and it was not using power enough. That was the message the Israeli electorate sent to the world. We are choosing now a government that believes that all the other governments were too weak, were too considering international law or international public. We don't care because we are Messianic, we have God on our side, doesn't matter why. Each one of them has its own explanation, but the result was even more brutality. And people forget it when they ask why did the Hamas burst into this operation on the 7th of October. It's amazing how nobody in the media, and I'm sure Laila will talk about it, has mentioned the fact of how brutal the Israeli oppression towards the Palestinians was from the day the new government in Israel was elected in November 2022 and the 7th of October. If you read the newspapers here in Britain, you will think that out of the blue, the 7th of October came as a brutal attack on the Israeli in the south, as if nothing happened between November 22 and October 23. And here, and I'm coming to, will this unimaginable brutality that, we thought in 2014 we saw the worst. Nothing compares, of course. The genocide in Gaza has moved not only the civil society, this was to be expected, but it's for the first time, it moved governments in the global south to think about sanctions and not just by symbolic acts of solidarity. It moved the international legal tribunals, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court for the first time to regard Israel as a possible guilty party in war crimes and crimes against humanity, by this, because these tribunals are very political, don't mislead yourself. They're not objective, professional legal tribunals. But they are political, and until recently when it came to Israel, their politics was to go with the elites of the West, and not to deal with Israel solely through international law. The first time they decided to heed what the civil societies around the world want the governments to do with Israel, given its brutality on the ground, which is sanctions and framing the Israeli actions as genocide and calling its leaders as criminals that should be tried by international tribunals. This is a symbolic call to the government. We are now listening to the people and not just to your cynical interests when it comes to Israel. That's why I think it's so important that these procedures were taking place. Even if they don't succeed in stopping, and it's terrible, then they won't succeed in stopping the genocide, they will be remembered in history as important landmarks of the beginning of change and the failure of the lobby in its most important power bases. The governments, the financial elites, the cultural elites, the academic elites, all these are the places where for 120 years, or 150 years in some cases, the lobby succeeded in either intimidating or bribing people to give full support to crimes against the Palestinians. I think that we are beginning to see the weakening of this support and the efficiency of this lobby. And therefore, I do think that even in this dark moment, and although this is not news for tomorrow or the day after, we should not lose hope in humanity and the ability of the next generations of politicians, media people, academics in countries that so far provided immunity to the Israeli action. We shouldn't lose hope that the next generation will be far more aware morally and consciously of their duty not to be complicit with the crimes that Israel commits, and not just being indifferent to them, but understand also their own role and their own accountability for what happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pappé. That was very comprehensive and ending on a note of historical, hopefully historical hope that things could get better even in a dark moment. I'd like to ask Leila to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being here. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Thank you to the Islamic Human Rights Commission and everyone who worked on this event for hosting this important discussion. I'm honored to be here with you all, with Dr. Ilan Pappé, who's been telling the truth about what happened to the Palestinian people in 1948, the planned and coordinated campaign of ethnic cleansing intended to remove them from their land by any means for decades, and for that, history will vindicate him. Because he's a truth teller. He's a truth teller who's told the truth for so long despite the consequences, with principle and with integrity. And he's challenged an entire society that has come together to bury the truth of the Nakba, which has been inflicted on the Palestinian people for 76 years. Today is the 259th straight day of Israel's war on Gaza. Every single day, Israel's inflicting horrors in Gaza beyond our imagination and our comprehension. And despite the valiant and courageous efforts of journalists, both professional journalists in Gaza as well as citizen journalists using cell phones, we don't even know a fraction of the crimes that the Israeli military has inflicted and is inflicting on the people of Gaza. It will take time for them to be revealed, and some of them we may never know. Now, the media is important in telling us these crimes and uncovering these crimes, but also in shaping the narrative. The narrative starts with the media. The media in journalism is often referred to as the first draft of history. The way that the Nakba was covered up and concealed, and the way that the valiant and courageous and important efforts of people like Dr. Ilan Pappé, he's undoing the first draft of history and the narrative that was shaped long ago. And that's why it's important for us to put into words how the media is failing monumentally so that we can hold them accountable and we can undo the narratives that are being shaped in real time so that it doesn't take us decades to undo these narratives. Every day, Israel inflicts horrors on Gaza that if they were happening anywhere else in the world, it would be front page news. Breaking news alerts sent directly to our phones, signaling that these deaths, these atrocities are unacceptable. But when the media, and in particular the Western media, declines to cover the horrors the way it would if they were inflicted against any other people, be they Israelis or Ukrainians, for example, it signals that Palestinian death is expected, it's accepted, and it normalizes Palestinian death just as it did before October 7th. The vast majority of those killed during the last 259 days, I think of that number and it's just incomprehensible to me, are women and children and elderly. Israel has broken all manner of record in this genocide of Palestinians. The most children killed in conflict zones around the world since 2019. By the way, we reached that milestone a very long time ago, months ago. The most journalists killed in any conflict in decades. In fact, 75% of journalists killed in 2023 were killed in Gaza. That too was achieved months ago. A record number of aid workers killed. The bombing of Gaza is the most destructive this century, by some accounts surpassing even the bombs dropped over Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined during World War II. Israel has destroyed every university in Gaza, in so many schools and mosques, in bakeries and hospitals. They've attacked water stations, fishing boats, aid convoys, children getting water, adults lining up for flour, people burying their dead, grandmothers waving white flags, holding the hands of their grandchildren. They've sniped children in the head, executed men point blank as their wives and children watched. Israel has destroyed everything that gives and sustains life in a place. It hasn't even left the dead in peace, as it bulldozed over graveyards and dug up the bodies of the dead repeatedly. I think about my own grandfather, who was displaced from his home by Israel, his home in 1948, lived all around the Arab world until it was only getting U.S. citizenship that allowed him to go back to Gaza because that's where he wanted to die. He died in 2019, and I think about what has come of his body. I think about Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old girl whose voice pleading to be saved was heard around the world. Imagine if Hind Rajab was anywhere else in the world. I think about the detained Palestinians who were tortured to death. Surgeries of children done on dinner tables with no anesthesia. Palestinians eating grass and animal feed, drinking dirty water, and on and on and on. There is simply no sense of this in the media that we consume day in and day out. No sense of the scope of the killing, even though it is so widespread that people who survived earlier attacks are being killed months later. And yet, the coverage of the mass killing and destructive of Gaza has been a monumental failure by the Western media, perhaps even surpassing the failure of the lead-up to the Iraq War. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are exceptions in some of the Western media outlets I'm discussing, whether it be CNN or the Washington Post or even the New York Times or the Guardian. There's exceptions. There are people within those newsrooms who are working very hard to do good work and to tell the stories that need to be told. But by and large, these outlets have framed the narrative in a way that is destructive and unforgivable and for which they must be held accountable. They have failed in their duty to inform the public about what Israel has inflicted on Gaza, and in many cases, the fact that they themselves, these media outlets, have abetted the Israeli government and military in spreading their propagandistic talking points, which are intended to justify the destruction of the land and the people of Gaza. One of the daily horrors happening in Gaza that simply has not been covered in the tone and tenor and scale that it deserves is the fact that we don't even know the real number of Palestinians killed by Israel. Just today, I believe at least 75 Palestinians were killed. Every day, we see what feels like an endless stream of social media videos and reports of dozens, at least, killed by Israel, and yet the official number goes up by only so much. And this is exactly what Israel intended when it destroyed the infrastructure tasked with keeping count of the dead, and killed the people doing it, and targeted the hospitals and other healthcare facilities tracking the dead. The media has also failed in adequately covering Israel's clear and deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war against the people of Gaza. People, including dozens of children, have died of starvation, and millions are at risk of famine, and yet the media has barely skimmed the surface of this crisis. A US poll found that even though this was when it was taken, the number was 30,000 more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis since October, half of Americans didn't know which side had lost more lives. That speaks so much to this monumental failure. All we ask of journalists, and I myself am a journalist, I have been for decades, is to do your jobs. That's all we say, do your jobs. Don't do any favors to Palestinians. Don't be biased towards Palestinians, but biased towards the truth. Be professional, hold power to account, tell the truth. The truth is that this did not start on October 7th. In fact, last year was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians, but the lack of coverage of the killings of Palestinians before October 7th, and the framing of October 7th as the beginning of the conflict, is the reflection of the media's normalization of Palestinian killing and oppression, which we are expected to accept, and the unstated but clear hierarchy of life that places a higher value of Jewish Israeli life than it does Palestinian life. It is as simple as that. As a friend of mine put it at the beginning of all this, I used to think it was ignorance, but it's not, it's racism. Now, this lack of context about the occupation is actually formalized in some cases. The Intercept website reported about a leaked New York Times memo which revealed that there are words that their reporters are discouraged from using, and they include occupied territories, ethnic cleansing, genocide, refugee camps, even the word Palestine. A spokesperson said, issuing the guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance. They frame their bias as nuance and accuracy. These are words that are accepted even by the international community, by human rights organizations, by experts. These are words enshrined in international law. They are not bias or opinion. This was a classic. The New York Times recently, rather than saying Palestinian land in the West Bank, said land long used by Palestinians. Every day there's a new one. There's a pattern of Western media reporting as fact, unverified, sensationalistic allegations that are shaping this narrative. And what this essentially amounts to is laundering stories from the Israeli PR machine through the media. So from the beginning, on October 7th, Israel sought to portray Hamas as ISIS, even naming them Hamas-ISIS, which never took off to their great dismay. That official state narrative included disseminating very specific inflammatory details that turned out to be false. Now, if you portray your enemy as the most barbaric, savage, vicious entity possible, you can justify the most barbaric, vicious, savage crimes against your enemy. So we were told by the media in particular, that Hamas-led fighters beheaded babies, put them in ovens, that they carried out a campaign of weaponized mass rape. These tropes based on the portrayal of the Arab Muslim, the Palestinian, as a savage rapist who would burn babies alive and put them in ovens, were disseminated by every single mainstream media outlet imaginable, including ones here in Britain, including the New York Times, which on December 28th published a front page article called "Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Rape," and on October 7th. And every single source in that piece has been found to have lied, their testimony debunked, and yet that piece remains uncorrected on the New York Times website. So much misinformation is reported as fact, the Israeli narrative not questioned. Israeli military and government officials are given endless time on TV to stop their propaganda. The Israeli narrative is taken as fact, while anything stated by Palestinians is viewed with suspicion, including the death toll. We saw this being repeated by politicians from President Biden on down. He claimed he saw photos of beheaded babies. He's still claiming to have seen things he's never seen. And even the White House had to dispute that claim. He claimed the death numbers by the Palestinian Ministry of Health were unreliable. And then later, a State Department official testified in Congress that it was in fact an undercount. There were also verifiably false stories that came out around the first attack against Al-Shifa. We're at a place in this genocide in which there are multiple rounds of attacks against hospitals, in which they claim that a calendar had the names of Hamas fighters. There circulated a video of an Israeli actress who claimed she was a nurse in Al-Shifa and that Hamas was using it as a base. There's a circular nature to this disinformation. When the State Department was pressed to provide evidence that Al-Shifa, Gaza's largest hospital, was being used by Hamas fighters, the State Department spokesperson pointed to news reports. But news reports are based on unverified and unsubstantiated claims by Israeli and U.S. officials. This is all too reminiscent of reporting that preceded the Iraq War, for which U.S. news organizations later had to apologize. Israel has claimed over the years that hospitals have been used by fighters in 2008, 2012, 2014. None of those claims were ever substantiated or verified. U.S. media organizations also adopt Israeli language and framing. At the beginning of Israel's military campaign, they referred to the Palestinian Ministry of Health as such, and then once the Israeli official state narrative held that it should be called the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, you saw them all running with it. Now, one important thing to note, and I only have 5 more minutes, and I have a lot more to say about the media coverage, so hopefully it will come up in the Q&A, is that never has the media been burned so much by a source, i.e. the Israeli military, and yet continue to use it over and over and over again. If a source lies to you repeatedly, do you keep using them? Are they still credible? The Israeli military in 2021 told media organizations that it was going to do a ground invasion into Gaza. They all ran with it, and then they admitted that in fact this was a war tactic in order to mislead Hamas fighters and have them go underground so they could bomb them. The Israeli military lied to all of us, including the US media, about how Shireen Abu Akleh, the legendary Palestinian Al Jazeera journalist, was killed. Even disseminating a fake video claiming that she was killed in crossfire by Palestinian fighters. There's still so much more to say, as I mentioned, but hopefully there'll be time in Q&A, but you are all consumers of news, so you all know, you all see the bias. It's screaming at us, the language that absolves Israel of any responsibility in the headlines, where it's like a riddle trying to figure out who's responsible for this. The BBC saying the 12-year-old Gazan girl who lost her whole family overnight. How did she lose her family? Who made her lose her family? Or the famous New York Times special about people killed in Gaza simply called lives ended in Gaza. Or Palestinians are bearing the brunt of lawlessness in Gaza as fighting at Al-Shifa continues. This was referring to a massacre perpetrated by the State of Israel at Al-Shifa hospital. Or putting the word man-made when discussing the famine in quotes as if it's not verifiably a man-made famine. There was not a failure of crops in Gaza. Israel decided to cut off food and water from Gaza. Or NPR calling it a low-intensity phase of the war when an entire Palestinian family was eliminated. You also see the use of emotive language like massacre, horrific, and slaughter only used when discussing the killing of Israelis, never when it comes to the killing of Palestinians. You saw American journalists like CNN anchor Abby Phillip tweeting, "Don't look away," about the fabricated story of beheaded Israeli babies, and yet these same anchors stay silent about the killing of more than 15,000 Palestinian children. You see Palestinians coming on the news and being treated as if they're officials, Palestinians who've lost family, who are analysts, who are experts, being grilled. That's when the accountability interview comes, not when they're actually talking to Israeli government officials. Now I want, just like Dr. Pappé, I want to end on a note of hope, which is that although I spent much of my time talking about the Western media, that's not all we have. We have Al Jazeera, we have the courageous efforts of journalists on the ground in Gaza, and due to their courageous, essential efforts, we know what's happening in Gaza. And we will never forget their efforts. So many of my colleagues who actually see the humanity of Palestinian journalists say that they've learned a new way of doing journalism, seeing them at work. And we also have people like Montez, like Bisan, like Hassia, people who use their platforms on social media to tell the world what's happening. So these Western media sources that used to have a monopoly on reporting, on shaping the narrative, no longer do. You see Gen Z kind of rejecting mainstream media due to that. And what I want to leave you with is this one note, which is just to ask how many of you are still following what's happening in Gaza day to day? Okay, thank you. This is a self-selecting group because you're here, but I know that it can be very difficult to see these images and very difficult to keep watching. I know a lot of us feel this fatigue to keep watching, but the least we can do is to continue to bear witness. Please don't look away. Please encourage others to keep looking and watching. My program, Fault Lines, came out today with a feature-length documentary called The Night Won't End. It's on YouTube. Please watch it. The Night Won't End. It's a documentary about Gaza, working with journalists in Gaza. Please watch it. Please share it. And please don't look away. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ariane, for a very powerful account of how mainstream media has been a catastrophic failure. Although Noam Chomsky might think that it's actually doing its job in a way of making making what is sayable very narrow, and everything else is pushed to the margins. But as you say, we live in a new world of digital media, and maybe that has been the difference this time around, really. And hopefully we'll get a chance to ask you about these issues in the Q&A. So thank you. So I'd like to ask Jonathan to go to the stage.
The topic for me before I even said anything. I actually have no idea why I'm on this panel. I Googled Israel-Palestine on the way here. That's basically how little I know about the issue. And that might be useful because I am a completely ignorant white guy on this issue. Basically, when I was growing up, I I actually didn't know Israel was a new country. I thought it had always existed, like from the time of the Bible. And so I remember when I was in grade school, many of my friends were, of course, like in tanks and stuff like that. We would read about the Merkava tank, and we would make fun of how the Israelis had like killed all these dirty Arabs, and they were just like these amazing fighters. I had no idea that this was. And then I'd see pictures on the news from, I guess, the first Intifada, although I didn't know what it was. You'd see like these kids throwing rocks. I just thought they were like random people throwing rocks for some reason. I had no idea why any of this was happening. So I thought Israel had always existed into college. Like when I became Muslim, I was in college. And even then, I didn't know anything about the topic. People were talking about Israel, Palestine. I was like, I don't really care about this issue. And then I saw this documentary called The People and the Land. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this documentary. It was made about the first Intifada, and I was in shock. I was crying. I couldn't believe what was happening, and I couldn't believe that my country was supporting this, was making this possible with money, with diplomatic support. I was in shock. I was so angry. I started to write letters to the university newspaper. I actually published, Layla, I don't know if you know this, I published an op-ed in the Washington, what's it called, op-ed, when you write the letter to the editor. I published a letter to the editor in the Washington Post in like 1998 or something. I was so angry, I couldn't believe it. And I actually really believe that if you just take like a random American, I don't know what British people, you just take a random American and you actually tell them what's happening, they will be absolutely outraged. Absolutely outraged. That's why the lobby is so important, right? Because it keeps people from talking about this. Keep people from knowing about it. And so my only expertise or my only insight that I have to offer is just as somebody who's kind of gone through this process of learning about this topic and then being a professor and seeing how the environment has changed, especially on campuses, but around this topic from the late 90s when I first became aware of it until today. Now, if it were 10 years ago, if it were 20 years ago, I would never in a trillion years have accepted to come to this event. This event wouldn't have happened. It would be like 5 people in the audience. I would be out of a job immediately upon leaving this event. I would have had like a heart attack on the way here, all sorts of things, from anxiety. So how did this change? I'm actually completely relaxed right now. I'm going to say a couple of controversial things when I'm up here. Why not? I am against apartheid. I'm against ethnic cleansing. I'm against killing children. I'm against killing non-combatants. I'm against genocide. So these are like, I actually feel like the other side on this topic has the position that's difficult to defend. I'm very comfortable with saying the things I just said. I will happily say them in front of anybody and don't care. Someone else wants to say apartheid is good, they can try and make that argument. Someone wants to say ethnic cleansing is good, they can make that argument, be my guest. But so much has changed on this issue that I can sit up here completely relaxed, and it's not just because I'm a tenured professor. I think even junior professors who don't have tenure in the United States, I think actually have been speaking out on this issue. Because the situation, the discourse around it has really changed. So I want to just talk quickly about why, at least in my opinion, why does this change? There's a couple of factors which I want to go through. The first one, and this is really weird, but I think it is important though, the Iraq War. Why was the Iraq War an important factor? Okay, I'll tell you why. Actually, you know who explained? No, Ash, I'm not asking a question, but I appreciate you offering an answer, right? The answer comes from a man who really knows how to make a point. Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump. That guy can communicate. I'm not a Trump supporter, just to be clear. So what he said, during the presidential debates, people would say, intelligence sources say that Vladimir Putin is and Trump would say, you mean the same intelligence sources who told you about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And of course, everyone says, oh, okay, fair enough, he's got a good point. When I was in college, in the late 90s, if you were having a debate and someone said, well, the CIA says something, that was it, the debate was over. What am I going to say? Do I know more than the CIA? Okay, fine, you're right. You're right, the debate's over. The Iraq War showed us that all these high and mighty organs of expertise in the US government and kind of the power elite can be completely wrong about something, right? And this really became clear, not only the fact that there was absolutely no weapons of mass destruction, but also around the 2006, 2007, when the Iraq War started to go really, really, really badly, there was a fascinating opening in American society for new voices on, quote unquote, what's happening in the Middle East. We've heard from, quote, the experts. Now let's hear from other people. Let's hear other, there's an opening for other points of view. And around exactly this time, two professors, John Mearsheimer, and I think it was Michael Walsh? Stephen Walsh, wrote their book on the lobby. First it was a long form article, and then a book came out. And for the first time talked about openly what you were not allowed to talk about. Everybody knew about it, but no one was allowed to talk about it, which was the Israel lobby. And they detailed its activities. They made a statement that thought it was sort of worked against American interests. And so now the unspoken had been spoken. Exactly at the time when there was this opening for new ideas about what was happening in, quote, the Middle East, right? Around the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu becomes the prime minister again. And Benjamin Netanyahu has done more for the pro-Palestine movement than any, and I hate to say this, because they're esteemed authors in our presence, but the guy opens his mouth and does more for the cause than 20 books written on the issue. Because he made the Israel-Palestine issue into a partisan issue in the United States. Before it was an issue of bipartisan agreement, it still is to a great extent, but not to the extent it used to be. Because the people who hate Benjamin Netanyahu more than anyone else in the world are liberal American Jews. The precise kind of constituency that funds and supports the Israel lobby in the United States. And one of the main supporters, not the only, one of the main supporters. So the idea, you can imagine sort of an educated Jewish American in New York, maybe a lawyer or a doctor, who's a liberal Zionist. They don't, they believe in Israel, but they don't, they want a two-state solution or something like that, right? Benjamin Netanyahu is a growing, painful thorn in their side, because he represents kind of religious Zionism, rightward shift in the Israeli politics, not wanting to have, doesn't seem to want to have a two-state solution, and he is getting closer and closer to the Republican Party. So there's a couple of instances during the Obama presidency where he really made it clear he didn't like Obama. He kind of insulted Obama publicly in these kind of diplomatic protocol faux pas. And so you see people like Thomas Friedman, New York Times contributor, right, who would previously never write anything critical of Israel, starts to write things critical of Israel, not because they were criticizing Israel as an apartheid system or Israel as a state or et cetera, because they didn't like Benjamin Netanyahu. And you still see this, by the way. You saw this with Chuck Schumer, the senior, Democrat in the Senate, U.S. Senate, gave a speech about maybe 1 or 2 months ago, a speech in the well of the Senate, saying Benjamin Netanyahu has to go. I mean, this was a really strong statement, something that you never hear kind of an American, certainly a Democratic senator from New York, the most senior Jew in the American government, making this statement that Benjamin Netanyahu, he is the symbol of everything that kind of liberal Zionists in America don't like. So that he opens a door to increased criticism. In the 2014, another major event, 2014 and 2015, which is the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protest movement. The Black Lives Matter protest movement, which you all know about, I assume, right? This had two important impacts regarding this issue. I'm just focusing on the Israel-Palestine issue. One, it opened up general criticism of kind of law enforcement and security states. before, I mean, I remember like when Layla and I would give talks or something about like civil liberties or entrapment or the rights of Muslims who've been accused of terrorism in 2010, 2011. It was, you'd go into a room and it felt like, you could feel like icicles forming in your blood. It was terrifying. Not just you were terrified of the police or the FBI, but you just feel like everybody thought you were crazy. It was like you're talking, you're wearing a tinfoil hat or something. Because, what do you mean? How could the FBI do something wrong? How could the government be like trying to kill people, innocent people? How could they try to arrest innocent people? Suddenly, the Black Lives Matter movement, you see video after video after video after video of random black men just being shot by police officers. They're running away, they get shot. They're standing there, they get shot. I can't believe this is happening. You're telling me these American people in the police force of the United States are actually shooting innocent people? Suddenly, that kind of criticism becomes popular. Sorry, not popular, possible, right? What Chomsky would call the range of thinkable thought gets expanded. And I mean, again, I'm a pretty good example. If you asked me in like 2013, do you think American police shoot random black people for no reason? I would say, of course not. They have to do something wrong. It's police don't just shoot random people. And then my wife would be like, what are you talking about? My father-in-law would tell me, would argue with me, but I would say, I don't believe this. Then I saw one video, 2 videos, 3 videos, 4 videos, 5 videos. I said, oh my God, actually they are just shooting random black people for no reason. So this one, really you start having criticism of American security state. 2, there's solidarity between the Palestine movement and Black Lives Matter. So people in the Black Lives Matter movement who have credibility in the US start to speak up on behalf of Palestine and give that issue credibility, right? And by the way, you can still see this today if you look at what, for example, makes the Biden campaign really nervous. They're nervous about Muslim and Arab voters in Michigan. They're really nervous about black voters in places like North Carolina because leaders in the different black churches have made it clear how absolutely disgusted they are with the Biden administration's policies towards what Israel's doing in Gaza. The last important point, and I want to try to give as much of my time to the Q&A, so I don't want to take your time or take time away from the other speakers. But the last really important point was the election of Donald J. Trump. Talk about expanding the range of thinkable thoughts. That man drove like a dump truck through the range of thinkable. He expanded it enormously. I mean, imagine this. The year when he was elected, 2016, you had a hijab-wearing Somali Muslim woman elected to House of Representatives, Ilhan Omar. You had a pro-BDS Palestinian Muslim woman elected to Congress. If you had asked me in 2010 if this was possible, if you had asked me in 2013 if this was possible, I would have said, I don't know, maybe in like 30 years, 40 years, maybe never. I mean, this man, Donald Trump, made the impossible possible. Someone like Bernie Sanders, in that same election cycle, made socialism, which had previously been outside, if you're an American and you talk about socialism, well, that's pretty weird. What are you, like a Russian? Soviet person or something like that? Suddenly, socialism is cool. People are going to Bernie rallies, right? So you can see in that election cycle this huge expansion of especially the left spectrum of the American political what is possible in the American political world. And again, in that space is the space for advocacy for Palestine. That leaves us where we are right now, which is, you should get one of these in general, like for just our conversations. You can 1 minute.
That was from me, by the way.
So that's my wife, by the way, in case you were wondering. That's why. Okay, so the cat is out of the bag. This is what Misa and I were talking earlier. The cat is out of the bag. Now, when, after what happened on October 7th happened, after these student protests, you have, let's say, really powerful American financiers like Bill Ackman. Like Bill Ackman.
Yeah, that's really
Oh, okay. I'll just talk.
Take the other one.
Sorry, Bill. Like Bill Ackman saying, you know, I'm not going to give jobs to people who.
You just press it up with a little light.
Lights off. Okay, I'll just talk really loud while they figure this out. Which is, they said, you know, we're not going to give jobs to people who, you know, make pro-Palestine statements, sign letters. If you're, the lobby is supposed to work in an unspoken way. Right? People are supposed to be intimidated, and no one's supposed to know why. No one's supposed to. If you have a lobby where you're saying, hey, public service announcement, if you make this type of statement, we're not going to give you a job. And by the way, it's anti-Semitic to say that I'm controlling the economy or something. It doesn't make any sense. You're saying, so wait, you're making public statements saying that you and your friends are going to conspire not to give me a job if I make a public statement. And you're saying this publicly. Everybody knows what's going on. Now it can be debated. If people like this, if the American population likes this perspective, okay, they can support it. If they don't like it, now it's out in the open to be discussed. And I think that is a very important turn of events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that. I just want to ascertain, how much time, when do we have to wrap up the event? So it's 10 to 8 at the moment.
About 8:15, 8:30, latest 8:30.
8:30, all right, so we have 40 minutes.
Shuffle it.
Okay, so we'll try to balance between people asking questions online, so I will cut to you at some point.
None so far.
And ask, okay, well, we encourage people who are watching this online to start sending in questions, and a selection of them will be put to the panel, maybe not all of them, but please put them. So I think we've got, I'm going to ask people to make short questions, and I'm going to pick 3. I'm going to ask for 3 at a time. And can you please direct your questions either to an individual on the panel or to the panel as a whole. So can I ask, so I'm going to take 3 short questions. Abdul Wahid, if you want to start.
Not that one. I think that one is in.
This is addressed to Professor Pappé.
Yes.
You said there are like 3 strands of Zionism throughout history: Christian evangelists, and then the elite Jewish people in Europe.
That's right.
And the imperialists.
That's right.
I think the imperialists wanted a type of Zionism they could control. And what I see today is that the revisionist Zionism is dominant, and they want to be their own boss now.
Right.
How do you see that tension playing out?
Thank you. So thank you for that question. So I'll take a second question.
I know maybe to all of you, I don't know. It's quite preposterous. It's like not conceivable to think this way, but quite a few people that I know been saying that, oh, this, the attack, the Hamas attack, was something that they've done knowing exactly what will come after. Is this something that you think that is possible? They knew, they kind of envisaged a situation that they were in a cul-de-sac, nothing was happening, and they had to make something, move something. I mean, my view doesn't matter, but we see the repercussions, we see what's happening. So.
And I'll take a third question from somewhere from the back, the lady there.
Yes, we know very well about Western media, but what about the media reaction in the Middle East?
Okay, so I think we can direct that to Leila, Dr. Leila. But let's start with Professor Pappé with the first question about Zionism. Sorry.
The moment you stop the histrionics, I can start talking. His phone is full of miracles. must be a problem. Do I need the mic? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, you have to speak right into the table.
No, they're not doing that.
Okay. You want me to move this one as well?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay. Anyone else has a mic? Okay.
Yeah, he's using the mic.
Yeah, well,
For the Q&A, it's hard because the mics aren't working properly.
Okay. You're right. It's a very good question that you're asking. There is a certain quid pro quo between American imperialism and Israeli policy. For instance, it was very clear to the lobby that they have to be very careful when they influence American policy in the Middle East as a whole. It was kind of an unwritten agreement. Actually, it was written on a small paper between President Ford and the Israeli government in 1991 that in return for non-American interference in what Israel is doing in Palestine, namely the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, regardless of whether they would condemn it publicly, but that they wouldn't do anything effective to stop the Judaization and so on, Israel would try not to undermine the American interests in the Arab world. Now, this particular government, I think you're absolutely right, this particular government, first of all, is totally connected to a certain part of American politics, has no connection with the Democratic Party whatsoever. They are connected to Christian Zionist, what is called the Tea Party in the Republican Party. So, for a certain American that probably are part of the base of Trump, this government is still okay. You know, coming to your question, are they kind of making life more complicated? For the Democrats and anyone else who is a bit more reasonable, I suppose you're absolutely right. This is, put it this way, for the more sober, and I don't use it in a positive way, the most sober part of American imperialism is the military industry, is the security industry and the financial investment. They're not dealing with Israel as a messianic thing or a Christian thing. They dealt with Israel for many, many years as a bonanza, as something that brings money and dividends, financial dividends, strategic dividends. I think the 7th of October, but not before, the 7th of October, that's my prediction, and I have to be careful. I'm willing to say that I'm proposing something, has turned Israel for these people from an asset to a liability. This is not particularly good news for the Middle East. What I mean by this is that the arms industry prefers to sell now weapons to Saudi Arabia than to Israel. First of all, the Saudis don't mention the Holocaust when they ask for weapons. And secondly, there is no, I don't know if you know it, but the way the Israelis trade on arms with America does not always benefit the military industry in the United States in terms of its profits. Straight deals with Saudi Arabia or with African countries or Southeast Asian countries are much more beneficial or are much more profitable for the American industry. So I think if I widen the context of your question, in the long run, this is one, it's not the only exclusive, it's one of the processes that would contribute to the end of Israel. Because Israel needs everything. It needs its Jewish communities in the world, and they're losing them. Israel needs the governments, and they're losing some of the governments. Israel needs the military industry and the multinational corporation, and they're losing them, not because these actors of the international system developed a moral constitution, but because it's not profitable. It's not profitable. And the best indication for this is Elbit and Elsit. I mean, these American giants are now withdrawing millions and millions of dollars of investment from Israel. Now, they're not doing it because they became part of the solidarity campaign with the Palestinians, because it's not a safe place to invest. So I think we should look at this as, in each one of them, if Israel is going to be left with the Christian Zionists as its main supporter, right? And maybe a small section of Jewish communities around the world, it's not just a matter that it won't be able to defend itself morally. I think it will also suffer significantly, financially and strategically. Of course, many other factors have to happen as well, but I think these are one of many indicators that make me hopeful that in the medium term, not the long term, in the medium term, we will begin to see a dramatic transformation of the reality in Palestine towards liberation and decolonization. It's very difficult to see it now because it looks very dark, but also the last days of the regime, apartheid regime in South Africa, were the worst in the history of that grouping. We have to not only to believe, of course, we have to be part of this transformation. We're not observers, we are part of this. To your question, quickly, if we understood it correctly, first of all, it's too early, I think, to understand. We don't know enough about the real plans and so on. What is very clear that there is so much that we don't know on the way the Israeli army behaved on the 7th of October in a very cynical and cruel way, in order, I don't know what, in order for Netanyahu to stay in power, in order to create a distraction for the civil war that was imploding inside Israel. And I'm sure this could not have been predicted by the Hamas. And I think, I remember this, people had just to listen to people, the leader of the Hamas and leaders of other Palestinian national liberations who were not part of the political Islamic group. They always said, we are at a stage where we are fighting for freedom and liberation. The next generation will decide what it's going to do. We are trying to survive and to exist. We're not building a new reality. We're trying to destroy the present one. And I think that's very important to listen to this. It's very important to listen to this because people confuse the discussion of what would be, how decolonized Palestine would look like in the future, and the fact that people are fighting there for existing, for survival, that they are under existential danger. Each one of them, every day, wherever they are in historical Palestine, are under existential danger, and people are not willing to be under such a threat without responding to such a danger.
Thank you. Leila, if you can answer the question about the Arab movement.
Sure. First, I wanted to just address the question about, did Hamas expect this was going to be the response by the Israeli military? Obviously I don't know what Hamas expected, but I just want to point out that this is a very racist and dehumanizing trope that the pro-Israel side often deploys against Palestinians, that, they don't care if thousands of their own people die, It's obviously meant to, again, portray them as these savage, barbaric people who just are bloodthirsty and just want to see their people die to maintain their own power. I've seen that. It doesn't make any sense, and the reality is Hamas leaders themselves have had their own children killed. We saw that a few months ago with the children of Ismail Haniyeh, for example. So, they're not aliens that came from outer space who themselves are insulated from everything that's happening in Gaza, right? So I would just say this is something that I've seen a lot and I think is deployed for this purpose, but I also think no one expected this. 8 months later, all these, all this insane death toll later, I don't think anyone expected just the sheer violence unleashed by Israel, and almost no pushback from its allies in the West, including the U.S. In fact, some people believe that if it was Donald Trump who was in office, at least the liberals, the Democrats, there'd be a lot more pushback to the U.S.'s kind of unfettered support, and that Israel wouldn't have been able to continue for this long or inflict this much damage. As far as the question about Arab media, I don't follow like every Arab media outlet as closely, but we all know that the majority of the journalists being killed in Gaza are either reporting for local Palestinian outlets in Gaza or some for sort of regional outlets. Unfortunately, I think some of the lack of solidarity and support from the media industry, particularly Western media, of these journalists is because deep down they don't consider them colleagues, they don't consider them professional journalists. Obviously Israel often smears these journalists as armed fighters, or as Hamas. They make these very inflammatory and always unsubstantiated claims about these reporters when they kill them or when they kill their family members. So we saw with the son of Al Jazeera Gaza bureau chief Wael al-Dahdour a few months ago when they killed his son Hamza and Hamza's colleague Mustafa Buraya and a third journalist. They said, oh, Hamza was a member of Islamic Jihad and Mustafa was a member of Hamas, but before that they said, oh, they were carrying a fighter in their car. Before that they said, oh, they were using their drone for military purposes. The story just kept changing and changing. And of course, when they made the claims that they were members of armed groups, never substantiated, never provided any evidence. The media kind of uncritically regurgitates it and publishes it, and then it just goes away. No one ever actually asks for hard evidence. I just wanted to end on this one note, which is, these journalists in Gaza are portrayed as being kind of unprofessional or being allied, propagandistic or allied with certain groups or whatever it is. Having worked with them for the last 5 months on our documentary in Gaza, they are some of the most professional, committed, resilient journalists I've known, and they're committed to the truth, at least the ones I've worked with. I can't obviously speak for all of them, but just to give you a quick example, I was working with a journalist about a field execution that took place in December, and I was asking him about some of the work and reporting he did on it. And he talked about interviewing some eyewitnesses and survivors, and I said, what about the neighbor? He said the neighbor heard something, but he didn't see it with his own eyes, so I didn't interview him. That kind of standard is simply not met in the Western media that I've seen on things like this Screams Without Words New York Times article I wrote that has been thoroughly debunked and yet still remains on the website, where they interviewed alleged witnesses to acts of rape who changed their stories over and over and over again, people who just completely fabricated accounts. They've never asked them for evidence. They've never been asked to back up their claims or anything like that. So, I don't know what that stuff is, but all this to say that they're very professional, and their professionalism in many cases exceeds that of reporting I've seen elsewhere.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the lady in front here.
So where's the Arab world, or is it the Muslim world that we need to consider in all of this that's happening in Gaza? Is there still something that we can call Muslim Brotherhood as a nation standing together? Is there still an Arab national community, if you like, international community, or are Palestinians on their own from Iran?
Okay.
I just want to follow up on that question for the professor. Have you considered or thought about investigating the role of Israel in the Arab regimes, the history of that? Because Israel itself agreed it has this massive international backing, etc. But there has to be a study done, I think, deeply to investigate the relationship of the various Arab regimes which allowed it to exist and actually had secret agreements and relationships which go back to the beginning of its creation. A lot of that stuff hasn't come out. I know certain academics are studying it, like LSE, Dr. Eddie Potter and stuff like this, and others. And there's been a lot of, disclosures of certain types of documents which indicate relationships with Sudan back in the 50s with Israel, with the Tunisian various parties with Israel, with Lebanon with Israel, Syria, etc., Saudi even. So this could be an interesting, new venture for you, perhaps a new book.
Do you work for One World? Are you a commissioning editor? So I'll take a third question, maybe one from the back. Anybody in the back? Nobody in the back, everyone's gone to sleep. Can't believe it. Okay, this gentleman here.
With all eyes on Gaza, there's been sort of a recent push to look at sort of annexing the West Bank. I think Marian Allison has committed $100 million to Donald Trump's campaign. How successful do you think that campaign will be, and maybe what are some of the things we as sort of individuals can do to counter some of those lobbying efforts in the U.S.?
So I'm going to let Jonathan take that final question first. Is that okay?
You realize I have no expertise on this topic, right?
Yeah, I know, but I can't let you get through the whole Q&A without answering.
Yeah, I would just say, as a non-expert on annexation, I don't know if this is wrong to say, I think they should, that would be great if they annexed the West Bank. Because they're already run it. They have this defense that their Palestinian Authority does things, and that they just go in anytime they want to kill someone, they go in and kill somebody. They want to harass people, they harass people, but they don't have responsibility for it because they're, what's happening? The microphone, or I should just shut up?
Coming in and out, so I think you should shout louder without the mic, not there.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's just, if you annex, it's not like they're not controlling it, and they put in settlers. Settlers can go in and do whatever they want. So at least annexation would make them finally have to. There wouldn't be any pro forma avoidance of responsibility. So maybe that's actually I don't know. I'm not an expert on this topic, but that might be something to think about. That's something for other people who know more about it than I do.
David, do you want to answer the question about Arab regimes and Muslim solidarity?
I can tell you that I've lost count of the videos, the heartbreaking videos I've seen in Gaza, where the first thing people say is, "Where an Arab? Where are the Arabs? Where the Muslimin? Where the Nas? Where are the people? Where are the Muslims?" This is something that's top of mind for the people of Gaza, who very much feel abandoned. They talk about the U.S. as well and the role of the U.S., but it's primarily, it never fails. Where are the Arabs? Where are they? Over and over again. I think Israel's, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think obviously Israel's a big reason why the Arab world is in the state that it is, with these kind of non-democratic regimes, let's just say, being empowered and supported by the world's powers in order to maintain Israel's power. And the reality is, we know that this doesn't reflect public opinion in the Arab world. This has always been the case, where people want to protest, they want to speak out, but we see what happens. In Egypt, a couple of students posted, why don't we have student protests? They were so inspired by the encampments in the United States. The next thing they knew, they were arrested. No one has seen them since then. So we know there's a price to pay for speaking out in these countries. People know what the red lines are. And we saw what happened with the Arab Spring, right? Those efforts to be able to express themselves politically were completely thwarted. And there were these counter-revolutions everywhere. So, I don't know, I think it's up to us in countries where we can do something, we can speak out, and we can organize, and we can criticize the media, to kind of lead the way and hope that one by one, some of these countries change and people can have their voices back.
First
Yes, first of all, the question of the Arab world, and then 3 questions here. I think you're right. It's a very important topic. There are several, as you said yourself, academics working on some of them. Avi Shleim, in his book, The Iron Wall, has covered certain connections the Zionist movement had with the Hashemites and later on with various Arab regimes. A book came out recently by Mahmoud Muharrib on certain connections as well. This crypto diplomacy of Israel has been covered, but you're absolutely right. I don't think there is, as far as I know, there's no comprehensive one, and it was definitely part of the strategy Israel was employing, was to what they call crypto diplomacy, is to sow dissent in the Arab world, but also build the kind of alliances that, as we saw during the warning attack from Iran, Jordan was, helping Israel to take down some of these drones. So definitely it's a good topic. I just want to say something before I go to the 3rd question on being alone and so on. It's I think there is a far more global network supporting the Palestinians than ever before. So I don't think it's true to say that they are alone. They're not alone. I don't know if people know, but there are encampments in Japan and South Korea. If you would think that Japan and South Korea would have people who demonstrated for the Palestinians, you wouldn't think about it. There is what I call global Palestine. There is definitely a network of minorities, indigenous people, countries in the global south, in the Muslim world, maybe not in the Arab world because of what Laila was saying, but in the Muslim world there are movements. And not all the Arab world is the same. Algeria is taking a very clear position on Palestine, we should mention it, and very different from Morocco, for instance, unfortunately. So it's a dynamic coalition. It's a dynamic coalition. What we don't have a Palestinian leadership that knows how to exhaust this very important solidarity. We need a Palestinian liberation movement that knows what to do with this energy. We don't have it. And secondly, the power of destruction is so immense and so drastic that unfortunately we're not able to galvanize this or to channel this energy, very positive energy towards Palestine, into stopping the genocide. And that's why I mentioned the ICJ and the ICC. I think they were very important landmarks that would help us. Now, the last question about the annexation. I'm a bit different. I don't want them to annex. I will tell you why. Because I saw their plans. Annexation for these political parties includes immediately the ethnic cleansing of every square mile that they would annex. Yes. The only thing that prevents Israel from ethnically cleansing the Palestinians of the West Bank is that it is not as yet officially annexed, the West Bank.
Where would they send them?
They would send them to Jordan. They would send them to Jordan. They have no, and they don't work like this. They annex areas, I don't know if people know Area A, B, and C, the horrible structure that the Oslo Accord has built. Area C is where supposedly Israel is ruling directly. Area B, Israel controls together with the PA. The West Bank, and Area A, which is 16% of the West Bank, is ruled directly by the Palestinian Authority. What the first step the Israelis will do, and they are going to do, is to annex Area C. And then they move the Palestinians from Area C. They already started, by the way. The media doesn't report it. Nobody's interested in the West Bank. Everybody's talking about Gaza. Yeah. So the Israelis can do what they want in the West Bank. They've already started ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Area C to Area B. Whole villages were already ethnically in the South Hebron Mountain and from the Jordan Valley, which is Area C, into Area B. The next step is to take over Area B and push Palestinians to Area A. And then take Area A and push Palestinians out of it. And pushing, as we know from the history of ethnic cleansing, is always accompanied by massacres and massive killing. So it's not just an easy transfer of people. So I think we should take this very, very seriously and continue to talk about, and I always suggested it before, but not about genocide in Gaza only. There's incremental genocide of the Palestinians that is unfortunately the logical outcome of the idea of Zionism as a settler colonial movement. Yes, they would have preferred people to leave voluntarily Palestine. They would have preferred to intimidate people and cause them to run away. And I'm not demonizing them in that respect. They would have preferred to be able just to force them to get on buses and lorries and push them to the other side. But millions of Palestinians are not abiding by these methods. And that's when it becomes a genocide. Not because there's a certain DNA of a genocide. Genocide is an elimination, is the utmost methods of elimination of a settler colonial movement. Now, there were less inhibitions in the 16th and 17th century, and therefore the white settlers could have easily genocided the Native Americans and the First Nations in Canada and the indigenous people of Australia and New Zealand. It's a bit more difficult to do it in the 20th century, 21st century, but it's, as we can see, it is being done. It is being done. So I think we should pay attention to Israel's policies in the West Bank, because I think that's the next station. Again, I'm not saying we cannot prevent it. You ask what we can do. We can do a lot. We can do a lot by making sure that this is also on the agenda. And whatever we do, we probably have to double and triple what we are doing if it's not working, because we are doing the right things. But we need to do more, undoubtedly. By the way, if I may say, there is a new list of independent candidates running for the July elections who have Palestine on their agenda as the main issue. Look for the names of these candidates and support them, and ask your friends in the constituency to support them. It would be very equivalent to what you talked about, BDS supporting members of Congress coming to the Democratic Party. We have a similar trend now in Britain. Look for those independents and ask, if it's not in your constituency, ask people to support them. Even 5 voices like this in the House of Parliament would be another important landmark in turning Israel into a pariah state and contributing to the liberation of Palestine. Thank you.
Just to take the chair's prerogative and ask a question of my own to Professor Pappé. Do you think that the Israelis are going to push the people of Gaza, very shortly into the Sinai? How likely do you think that is, or will the external pressure delay that or reduce it?
There are 2 strategies that, if one can call them that way, that are being contemplated by Israel, by the Israeli government, not by Israel, but the Israeli government. The extreme right had a huge conference a week ago, a huge conference, in which it detailed its plans for the Judaization of Gaza. It was attended by the Minister of National Security, by the Finance Minister, and by important members of Knesset. And it was a very detailed kind of program. And it includes massive expulsion. They claim they already have the agreement of Abdel Fattah Sisi for building with American Republican donors a huge refugee city on near El Arish on the Egyptian side of the Sinai. So very much depends how much control these people would have on Israeli policy, they would try to implement. There is a more pragmatic, if one can call it that way, Israeli political forces. They are not contemplating huge ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza, but they are hoping that the situation would persuade quite a lot of people. They are quoting a number which I'm afraid is correct, that already 300,000 Palestinians have left the Gaza Strip. And they are hoping that the continued military action would cause it. Namely, it's an ethnic cleansing, but it's, I think you were talking about something more intentional and systematic. So they believe that their military actions would downsize the number of people in Gaza. But they are not dealing with destinations. They're not saying where should they go. It's like an individual choice of people. Yes, so I think that if it's up to them, but it's hopefully it's not just up to them. By the way, it was so interesting in this conference, which I followed. They were also making preparation for building Jewish settlements in south of Lebanon. They had a very detailed program, because the Israeli army is going to attack South Lebanon very soon. It's going to try and push Hezbollah north of the river Litani, and they're already thinking of building Jewish settlements in South Lebanon itself. And this was a dream of these Messianic Jews anyway, because they believe the land of Israel begins in the north in the river Litani, which is kind of a natural border of the biblical. That's the way they interpret the Bible, it doesn't matter. But it matters because we have to take seriously these fanatics and crazy Israeli leaders who have wide support in the Israeli Jewish society. And we just hope that this is another red line that the world would say, no, this is too much. But we've said it before. We can only hope that the more extreme and unimaginable the things they are doing, the more we are likely to have allies in our campaign in places where up to now we didn't have any allies. Political elites, mainstream media, mainstream academia, because you keep asking yourself, what else do they have to see and listen and understand in order to be able to join us?
Thank you for that analysis, Professor Pappé. We've got time for one more question from Masoud Shajura in the front row.
Thank you very much. It's actually more of a comment. Professor Brown said something about his experience of awakening thank you. It reminds me of many years ago when I was a young man in US and I was studying at Berkeley. It was late 60s and Vietnam War, and a lot of us went through exactly the sort of thing that you express. You know, we didn't really believe that the establishment and system is capable of the crimes which was committing in Vietnam, or indeed it will support the apartheid or be involved in the racism. So that awakening is something that I have experienced, and in some ways it's almost like deja vu, you know, seeing it again. Now, I personally don't want the current university students and the community will come back in another 50 years' time, be in my position, looking at, saying, hey, we're doing it again. So I think it's very important to recognize that the system is the problem. It's not the individuals who are in the power. We were conned, we were led to believe, pressurized through all sorts of things. And the people who were involved at that time, some of them end up being Clinton and others, and selling out the whole idea. I think we need to make sure this time around that we concentrate on changing a system that doesn't really care for every citizen. It cares really for that 1%, and it's all been geared to actually support that 1%, which includes arm industry and so forth. If we don't address it on that way, we are going to see it over and over. Next generation, the following generation, and we will see deja vu after deja vu. I think we need to address it on that level, just as an old, cynical man.
Not cynical, realist, and wise show. I'm afraid we have to bring this to a close. I hope you join me in showing a mark of appreciation to our distinguished panel. Thank you.